Sometimes a single act of kindness can spark a change so powerful, it not only alters the life of the person receiving it, but also the one giving it. In today's fast-paced world, compassion is often overlooked. But what if I told you that one man's simple decision to help a stranger led to a journey of redemption, healing, and transformation? This is the story of Josh, a nurse who defied indifference, and Mike, a homeless man who had lost all hope. But their encounter is more than just an act of charity. It's a reminder of how empathy can ripple through our lives in ways we never expect. As Josh steps beyond his professional duties, he begins to mend not only Mike's broken body, but his own fractured soul. This is a tale of two lives, intertwined by fate, bound by compassion, and healed through solidarity. Stay with me as we dive into this moving journey, one where dignity is restored, wounds are healed, and redemption finds its way back into two hearts. It was a cold, rainy evening when Josh finished his exhausting 12-hour shift at the hospital. As he stepped outside, the city streets glistened under the soft glow of streetlights, but the weight of the day hung heavily on his shoulders. The murmurs of indifferent colleagues, quick to clock out and eager to forget about the world beyond the hospital doors, echoed in his mind. They had all seen him, the homeless man, Mike, huddled near the entrance. Dirty, disheveled, and clearly injured, Mike was just another forgotten face to them. To Josh, however, there was something about the man's defeated posture that made him pause. Josh's instinct as a nurse told him not to walk away. He stood frozen for a moment, torn between the comfort of going home and the moral pull deep inside him. He glanced back at the hospital, where he knew the staff would roll their eyes at him if he brought in another hopeless case. But as Josh approached Mike, his heart spoke louder than his fatigue. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Mike barely looked up, muttering something incoherent. His clothes were soaked, and a deep cut on his leg had become infected, an open invitation for the kind of neglect society had long offered him. Josh could feel the judgment of his peers in the back of his mind, the silent whispers of "just leave him be" or "he's beyond help." But that was not who Josh was. Compassion, after all, didn't have a job description. Without hesitation, Josh knelt beside Mike and helped him up. The man recoiled at first, his pride still lingering beneath the layers of hardship. "I don't need your help," Mike mumbled. Ignoring the resistance, Josh gently insisted, guiding Mike through the hospital's side door, where fewer eyes would notice. The smell of antiseptic filled the air as Josh settled Mike into an empty room, his movements careful, yet firm. As he cleaned the wounds and bandaged the leg, he couldn't help but wonder about the man's story. What life events had led him to these streets? Mike didn't offer much at first, only a guarded silence, broken occasionally by brief, pained breaths. Josh's colleagues weren't blind to what he was doing. "Why are you wasting your time on him?" a nurse whispered harshly as she passed by, shaking her head. But Josh didn't flinch. He had always believed that no one was ever a waste of time. His mother used to say, "The people most overlooked are the ones who need the most love." Those words echoed in his mind as he finished treating Mike, his hands steady, his heart full. As Mike's wounds began to heal, something deeper started to shift. For the first time in years, Mike felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. Josh didn't just clean his cuts. He treated Mike like a person, someone worthy of dignity. And in doing so, Josh wasn't just helping Mike. Unbeknownst to him, Josh was taking the first step on his own journey of healing, a path that would soon lead him to confront the broken parts of his own life that he had long buried. As the days passed, Mike's wounds began to heal, but the scars on his soul remained raw and unspoken. Josh noticed the hollow look in his eyes, the way he stared blankly at the ceiling during their conversations. There was a heaviness about him, a weight that went far beyond his physical injuries. One evening, after several silent treatments, Mike finally spoke. His voice was rough, as if unused to carrying words of vulnerability. "I wasn't always like this," he muttered, staring out the hospital window, lost in a world Josh couldn't yet see. Mike's story unraveled slowly, like peeling back layers of a weathered and worn tapestry. Once he had a family, a wife he adored, a daughter whose laughter used to fill their small home with joy. He had a steady job, nothing glamorous, but enough to provide for those he loved. But life, as it often does, threw Mike into a spiral. The death of his wife in a tragic car accident shattered him. Grief consumed him, leaving him a shadow of the man he used to be. He turned to alcohol, not to feel good, but to feel nothing. Slowly, he lost everything: his job, his home, and eventually his daughter, who was taken into foster care when he could no longer care for her. Each word Mike spoke seemed to weigh him down more, and Josh listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. The man before him wasn't just a homeless person. He was a father, a husband, a human being who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. After that, Mike whispered, I stopped trying. No one cared. So I stopped caring too. Josh could feel the pain in every syllable. He understood, in a way, the loneliness Mike had been battling. Though their lives were different, Josh knew what it felt like to carry unresolved pain, to be weighed down by emotional scars. He could see now that Mike's struggle wasn't just survival, it was a battle to remember who he was, to hold on to a shred of the person he used to be. The world had given up on Mike, and Mike had given up on himself, but not Josh. He wasn't ready to give up on this man who had been so brutally discarded. He saw the flickers of life in Mike's story, moments that had once brought him joy. The love for his daughter was still there, buried beneath years of pain and regret. Josh began to speak about second chances, about the possibility of rebuilding, slowly, one step at a time. But Mike was skeptical, resistant even. You don't get it, he said, frustration mixing with sorrow. Once you're this far gone, there's no coming back. Yet Josh refused to accept that. You're not gone, he replied firmly. You're still here. You've made it this far. That counts for something. It was a simple statement, but in that moment, it was everything Mike needed to hear. For the first time in years, someone wasn't just offering him food or money. They were offering him belief. Belief that he could be more than the sum of his failures. Slowly, the invisible walls Mike had built around himself began to crack. He started opening up more about his life on the streets, the violence, the hunger, the humiliation. You stop feeling like a person, he admitted one night, his voice trembling. People look through you like you don't exist. But Josh saw him. Josh always saw him, and that made all the difference. Bit by bit, through these moments of vulnerability, Mike began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back from the darkness. While Josh helped heal Mike's physical and emotional wounds, his own life began to unravel in unexpected ways. The more time he spent listening to Mike's story of loss and regret, the more it stirred something deep within him, his own unresolved pain. For years, Josh had buried the hurt caused by his strained relationship with his father, Phil. Their fallout had been slow, but inevitable. Phil had never supported Josh's decision to become a nurse, dismissing it as not a real man's job. Their conversations had become tense, and eventually they stopped talking altogether. It had been years since they'd spoken, and the silence weighed heavily on Josh, though he never admitted it out loud. But as Mike spoke about his daughter, the one person he'd lost but would do anything to get back, Josh felt a growing ache. It wasn't just Mike who needed redemption, Josh did too. He started to see the parallels between their lives. Like Mike, he had let pride and hurt build a wall between himself and someone he loved. Josh could no longer ignore the nagging thought, what if I lose my chance to make things right with my father? He had spent so long nursing the wounds of their broken relationship that he had forgotten how to heal them. Late one night, after another long conversation with Mike, Josh found himself sitting in the hospital break room, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over his father's contact number. It had been years since he'd even considered calling, but Mike's words echoed in his mind. You don't know how much time you have left. With a deep breath and a racing heart, Josh hit dial. The phone rang, and for a moment, he hoped it would go to voicemail. But then, his father answered. Josh? Phil's voice was rough, surprised but not unkind. What followed was an awkward exchange, filled with long pauses and uncertainty. Neither knew quite what to say. The years of silence had built a chasm between them, and neither was sure how to cross it. But something was different this time. Josh, emboldened by his conversations with Mike, spoke first. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have called sooner." The words came out shaky, but they were real. Phil was quiet for a moment, then he sighed deeply. "I've missed you, son. I didn't handle things right. I just didn't know how to fix it." In that moment, both men realized how much time had been wasted, time they couldn't get back, but could still salvage. Their conversations stretched into the early hours of the morning, filled with confessions, regrets, and finally, a tentative hope. Phil admitted his own regrets, how his pride had kept him from reaching out. Josh, for the first time in years, felt the weight of bitterness lift. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the first step toward healing, a chance neither of them thought they'd have. As Josh helped Mike rediscover his dignity and humanity, he was unknowingly on his own path of redemption. The act of caring for Mike had opened a door inside Josh, one that led back to his father. And though it was scary, though it forced him to confront years of resentment, it also brought with it the possibility of a future unburdened by old wounds. Mike had been right. There was always time to make things right, as long as you had the courage to try. Josh's journey with Mike became more than just about saving one man's life. It became a mirror reflecting his own need for forgiveness, for healing, and for reconnection. Just as Mike was learning to believe in second chances, so was Josh. And in helping Mike stand again, Josh began to stand taller in his own life, ready to rebuild what had once seemed lost. The decision to call his father had been hard, but actually seeing him again, face to face, was even harder. Josh felt his hands tremble as he stood outside his father's house, a place he hadn't visited in years. The old front porch looked exactly the same, as if time had stood still. But inside Josh, everything was different. His heart pounded with uncertainty. What if this attempt to reconnect made things worse? What if too much damage had been done? With a deep breath, he knocked on the door. When Phil opened it, the years of distance between them hung in the air like a thick fog. Josh hadn't seen his father in so long, and the sight of him, a little older, a little grayer, stirred something deep inside. Phil's face softened as their eyes met, a flicker of emotion crossing his weathered features. "Josh," he said quietly, as if testing the waters, "come in." They sat in the living room, awkwardly at first, surrounded by the silence of all the things left unsaid over the years. The tension was palpable, but neither man seemed to know where to start. Finally, Phil broke the silence. "I never meant for things to go this far," he admitted, his voice rough with regret. "I always wanted the best for you, and when you chose to be a nurse, I didn't understand. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just pushing you away." Josh felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing his father's vulnerability, something he had never shown before, cracked the wall Josh had built around his own heart. "I needed you to believe in me, Dad," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I needed you to understand that nursing was my way of helping people, of making a difference. But when you didn't, I guess I stopped believing in myself too." Phil's eyes, once so stern and distant, now brimmed with tears. "I was wrong, son. I should have been proud of you. You've done more good in the world than I ever have, and I see that now. I was just too stubborn to admit it." The weight of his words hung in the room, heavy with years of pent-up emotion. The floodgates opened. They talked for hours, about everything, about the misunderstandings, the pride that kept them apart, and the regret that had festered in both of them. Josh confessed how the estrangement had left him feeling untethered, while Phil admitted how his own pride had cost him his relationship with his only son. With each word, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the silence that had once defined their relationship replaced by something more powerful: understanding. At one point, Phil reached out and put his hand on Josh's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of years of absence. "I'm proud of you, Josh," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I always have been. I just didn't know how to show it." For Josh, those words were like a balm on a wound he hadn't realized was still open. His father's pride, something he had longed for, was finally being spoken aloud. In that moment, they both realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about acknowledging it, facing it together, and deciding to move forward. For the first time in years, Josh felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just a son who had been hurt, and Phil wasn't just a father who had failed. They were two men, both flawed, but both willing to try again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As they sat together, the sun setting outside, casting a warm glow over the room, Josh felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The reconciliation wasn't a grand, dramatic moment, but rather a quiet, steady rebuilding of trust. A step toward a future where their relationship was no longer defined by pride or hurt, but by the shared understanding that love, even when bruised, can still heal. And as Josh left his father's house that evening, he knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. As Mike's body healed, so did his spirit. Though the process was slow and filled with uncertainty. In the beginning, he resisted every attempt Josh made to help him beyond his immediate injuries. For Mike, the world had long ago shown him that there was no point in hoping for anything better. But as the weeks passed, the consistency of Josh's kindness began to chip away at the layers of bitterness and mistrust that Mike had built around himself. Josh didn't just see Mike as a patient. He saw him as a human being, worthy of dignity, worthy of a second chance. One afternoon, Mike finally opened up in a way he hadn't before. Sitting by the window of the hospital, watching the world outside carry on without him, he said, "I used to be somebody, you know? I had a family, a job. I even had dreams." His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words was heavy. He spoke about his wife, the woman he had loved more than anything, and the daughter he had adored but lost touch with after his life fell apart. "I let them both down," he whispered, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I lost everything when I lost them." For so long, Mike had believed that he was beyond saving. The streets had become his home, the cold pavement his constant companion. But now, with Josh's unwavering support, he began to question that belief. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild, to try again. Josh had planted a seed of hope in him, one that slowly started to grow. Mike realized that the first step toward healing wasn't just letting others help him. It was learning to forgive himself. It wasn't easy. Mike had grown used to rejection, to being invisible. There were moments when he would push Josh away, convinced that no one could truly care about someone like him. But Josh never wavered. He continued to show up, to listen, to remind Mike that his life mattered. And little by little, Mike's walls began to crumble. He started participating in his own recovery, asking about rehabilitation programs and what he could do to get back on his feet. The turning point came when Josh introduced Mike to a local shelter that offered not just a bed and a meal, but also counseling and job placement services. At first, Mike was hesitant. He had been to shelters before, and they had only ever felt like temporary fixes to a permanent problem. But this time was different. This time, Mike wasn't walking in alone. He had someone who believed in him. Someone who reminded him that his past didn't have to define his future. Over the next few months, Mike began to transform. He joined a vocational program at the shelter, learning new skills and rebuilding his sense of self-worth. Slowly, the man who had once lived in the shadows began to step into the light. He reconnected with his daughter, writing her a letter that, to his surprise, she answered with cautious optimism. It wasn't an immediate reunion, but it was a start. A thread of hope that gave Mike the strength to keep moving forward. Perhaps the most significant part of Mike's transformation was not just that he started rebuilding his life, but that he wanted to give back. Mike began volunteering at the shelter that had taken him in, offering support to others who, like him, had once believed they were beyond help. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," he told one of the shelter's residents, "but trust me, you're not." His words carried the weight of experience, and in helping others, Mike found his own redemption. By the end of his journey, Mike was no longer the broken man who had collapsed at the hospital entrance. He had found a new purpose, a new way forward. He wasn't just surviving, he was living, one step at a time. And through it all, He knew that it had started with a single act of compassion, the kindness of a stranger who saw him not for what he had become, but for who he could still be. Mike's transformation wasn't just about healing wounds or finding shelter. It was about rediscovering his sense of humanity and belonging. As the months passed, the man who had once believed he was invisible to the world now stood taller, with a renewed purpose. He had reconnected with his daughter, started working at a local community center, and rebuilt his life step by step. But Mike's journey of redemption wasn't just his own. It was deeply intertwined with Josh's. Together, they had both found healing, though neither had expected it when they first crossed paths. Josh, too, was feeling the changes ripple through his life. His reconciliation with his father, Phil, had brought a kind of peace that he hadn't known in years. The awkward phone calls turned into regular visits, and Josh started spending weekends with his father, cooking dinner together and talking about the things they had avoided for so long. Phil, once a distant and critical figure in Josh's life, now made an effort to understand the man his son had become. For the first time, they weren't just father and son. They were friends. As Josh watched Mike's life unfold, he couldn't help but feel that in helping Mike, he had also helped himself. Mike's struggles had mirrored his own in so many ways. The loneliness, the regret, the missed chances. But in watching Mike reclaim his dignity, Josh realized that it was never too late to change your story. Redemption wasn't something that just happened. It was something you worked toward, step by step, just as Mike had done. One afternoon, after Mike had been working at the community center for several weeks, he came to visit Josh at the hospital. There was a light in Mike's eyes that Josh hadn't seen before, a sense of pride and accomplishment. "You'll never believe it," Mike said with a grin. "I'm running the outreach program now. Me, the guy who thought he'd never get off the streets, helping other people get back on their feet." Josh couldn't help but smile, feeling a surge of pride for his friend. Mike had gone from being the one who needed saving to the one offering a lifeline to others. But there was one final piece to Mike's redemption, one that he had long feared would never come. His daughter, who had been hesitant to reconnect at first, had agreed to meet him. The day arrived and Mike stood outside the cafe where they had arranged to meet, his heart pounding in his chest. Josh had offered to go with him for support, but Mike had insisted on doing it alone. This was his moment, the culmination of everything he had worked for. When his daughter walked through the door, Mike's breath caught. She was grown now, a young woman with a life of her own, but her eyes still held the same warmth he remembered. Their reunion wasn't perfect. It was tentative, filled with awkward silences and years of unspoken hurt. But as they talked, Mike realized that just as Josh had forgiven his father, his daughter was offering him the same gift. They weren't just meeting as strangers, they were meeting as family, ready to rebuild what had been lost. By the end of their conversation, they shared a hug, and in that moment, Mike knew that he had finally come full circle. Josh, watching from afar, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had been there from the beginning, witnessing Mike's lowest point and now his greatest triumph. But this wasn't just Mike's story, it was Josh's too. Through helping Mike, Josh had found the courage to mend his own relationships, to confront the wounds he had hidden for so long. And in doing so, he had discovered that redemption wasn't just about second chances. It was about finding the strength to believe in them. The story of Mike and Josh wasn't just about healing individual wounds. It was about the power of compassion to transform lives. It showed that when you reach out to someone in need, you're not just offering them a lifeline, you're also opening the door to your own growth. As Mike continued his work at the community center, and as Josh grew closer to his father, both men knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed by that one moment of compassion. And in the end, that single act of kindness had created a ripple effect of healing, redemption, and the rekindling of hope. In the end, this story of compassion shows us that a single act of kindness can change the course of not just one life, but many. Josh's decision to help Mike wasn't just about healing physical wounds. It was about restoring dignity, rekindling hope, and building a bridge between two souls lost in their own struggles. Through Mike's transformation, Josh found the strength to mend his own broken relationships, proving that compassion and solidarity can create ripples far beyond what we can see. We all have the power to offer a second chance, to help someone rediscover their worth. And sometimes, in lifting others, we find ourselves lifted too. Mike and Josh's journey reminds us that redemption is always possible, even when it feels out of reach. It's never too late to show kindness, to heal, and to find hope once more. If this story inspired you, imagine what else is waiting for you. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and explore more powerful stories on our channel. Your next favorite video could be just a click away.